So yeah, we're dealing with ecological identities and initiatives in Russia's regions. My background is as a forest ecologist. I've worked with Russian forest mostly from afar for a long time. Therefore, I can talk a lot about Pinus siberica. I tend to mispronounce Russian terms. Just don't laugh too much if I try. What drew me to Russia was the fact that it has the largest forest on Earth. Russia owns more of the Earth's terrestrial carbon than any nation in the world. If you count the frozen carbon in the ground of the permafrost of the taiga, it holds 1/3 of the Earth's carbon, which means when you warm it, you produce a greenhouse gas that can induce further warming. And Russia has the interesting feature that warming Russia from a greenhouse of warming could produce more warming. It's like it kicks in and adds more. It is perhaps unique in this regard. It's certainly both a treasure to Russia and also scientifically a place of great interest.
Emerges at the confluence of several different projects. My long-term interest in the work of Ivan Turgenev, which led me initially to the Orel region south of Moscow, and an ongoing project examining cultures of water in Russia, a collaboration with Aiga Rosenholm in Finland, and other European and American scholars. As my contribution to that water project, I've embarked on the exploration of holy springs in the Orlovskaya Oblast, a project that opens a series of intriguing questions and avenues for exploration about the relationship between canonic literature and place, about the revelations and erasures of particular places in literary writing, and about the long-term identities of a place like Orel, very much bound up with the fame brought by canonic literary figures. Some of these questions are connected to my current institutional and intellectual home in environmental studies, where questions about how people value place, how they articulate and defend particular places, have come to occupy an increasingly central role in my teaching and writing. This work on the springs of Orel has both literary and experiential roots. Since I first went to Orel because of Turgenev 30 years ago, but then found Orel so fascinating and amenable to travel with students that I've returned at least a dozen times, often for month-long stays. The landscapes and springs I'm working on in these projects are places I've visited repeatedly over the years, places where I've heard interesting stories from locals, places that have also generated their own streams of new narrative. Those new streams are the final piece of what intrigues me about this project. Interestingly enough, my interest in trying to understand the phenomenological or experiential aspect of place has led me not just to particular topographies and embodied rituals, but to the internet and cyber stories. For it turns out that if you want to understand these springs' meaning for contemporary Arlovchania, or even simply to find them, the web is a key source. The sources of my title are then multiple: hydrological features in a landscape that is hospitable to them, place-based sources of identity, evident both in narrative and in rituals of visitation and memory, and web sources that emerge as new mediums of narrative circulation. So, Orel Radnik, a website chiefly concerned to gather information about holy springs and make it possible for people to find them, claims that there are at least 100 holy springs in the Orel region. That's a number that keeps growing. The site is not an official church site, and there's some evidence that the church itself thinks that there are fewer holy springs, which is hardly surprising, since springs like this have historically occasioned disputes between local faithful and church authorities. Whether or not that's a lot of springs, I have no idea. I need to talk to a hydrologist. The oblast sits at the intermediate point between open steppe and northern forest and includes a significant swath of glacial incursion in the northwest that is home to vegetation associated with much more northerly regions. Sources I've consulted refer to the significant number of underground rivers that underlie parts of the region, which on its surface is characterized by ravines. This is a map on the site of somebody I'll talk about in a little bit, Oleg Davidov, who's a Moscow-based writer and essayist. And this is his map of the region, which I actually really love. This is what you would call a bioregionalist map. That's an American term that I hope some of you are familiar with. And what it is the Aka River network, which as far as I can tell looks like a pair of lungs, with Moscow, a very, 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 very tiny little heart up there. But anyway, but he notes that the Orel region brings together the headwaters of three major river systems, the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Don. The claim on the Orel Rodnik website, however, isn't for the existence of springs per se, but holy springs. Now, just what is meant by sacred is a complex question. Ethnographers and historians of religion often use the term venerated, suggesting popular attributions of healing properties to a particular land form. Veneration attested in many, many, many cultures, and which almost always or always precedes institutional consecration. I will note that the most compelling discussions for me of the sanctity of particular places involve a recognition not simply of cultural constructions, but of the place itself, an acknowledgement that places are not blank slates, but participate in and to some extent draw forth the cultural meanings attributed to them. Holy springs in the Orel region are quite obviously embedded in received and evolving systems of symbolic meaning that involve popular belief, Russian Orthodoxy, krayevedenia, histories of both pre-revolutionary and post-Soviet Russia. But there is also something about the experiential, the phenomenological reciprocity of humans and the more than human in these places, which also needs to be recognized and thought about. So to ground us a bit, I'm going to give you a very brief description of one of the springs I've visited at Salty Key, which is south of Orel on the road to Kursk. The site is actually comprised of two springs emerging from a limestone bluff at a place where the Aka River makes an almost right-degree turn. From the top of the bluff, you look out on a broad agricultural landscape. Below, it's shaded, and there's a dirt road that allows people to drive up if they don't want to make the steep descent on foot. The springs themselves create a kind of grotto into which is set small icons. A tree on one side is covered with scraps of cloth and ribbon left by visitors as gestures of prayer or supplication. There's a sign asking people not to leave garbage. Sites like this often instruct visitors in various forms of appropriate behavior, including what an American would call leave no trace. The last time I visited, which was about a year ago, the instructions were being respected, and the pile of trash that had been there in 2006 was gone. Visitors come to the spring either for what I'll call utilitarian or spiritual reasons, to collect water in big receptacles, municipal water systems being what they are. Water from springs is highly valued for purity and taste, or they come to make a series of ritual washings as pilgrims. Depending on the spring and the infrastructure, one can dip one's hands, drink water, or fully immerse oneself in a specially constructed and enclosed pool. The Salty Key Spring has no infrastructure at all. I've visited twice, both times accompanied by two remarkable local priests, one Catholic, who you see here, Polish Catholic, and one Orthodox. Their account of the history of the site includes its function as a place of covert baptism during the Soviet era and a place of popular veneration that at various points Soviet authorities attempted to either destroy or contaminate. Both of these motifs, covert liturgical site and attempts at spoiling, are widespread in internet histories of other springs in the region. So I want to weave back for a moment to the literary origins of my interest in these springs, since it was Turgenev who first got me here. And representation of places like this in canonic texts is part of what interests me. Turgenev includes an indirect description of another of Orel's springs in his 1853 Poyezdka v Polesye, which is a narrative about a two-day trip into a forbidding forest in the northwest corner of the region. The hunter narrator of that story is rescued from a bout of extreme angst by his peasant guide who brings him water from a nearby spring. The simple gesture of offering water gets loaded in the story with cultural symbolism, an echo of living waters, which is a reference to both folk culture and Christianity, but also the invocation of a landscape of hiddenness that promises resuscitation for the world-weary intelligent. There's a striking repetition of this topological conceit in a novel written a century later, Leonid Leonov's 1953 Ruski Les. Two boys, the future environmental hero and his boyhood friend, who's a budding capitalist, get lost in a forest and rescued by an old woodsman. The encounter with both the peasant figure and the forest involves imbibing the spirit of the place in a drink of spring water. And I'm going to quote, there's quite explicit mythologizing in Leonov's text. And I'm quoting here. The spring is no bigger than a child's palm, but is nonetheless the cradle of a great Russian river. That river separates the northern plain into two halves, so that half of the country was watered with living water from this gully. There were neither earthen embankments nor Kremlin walls nearby, but all that the state called its own. Endless fields with their overarching storm clouds, libraries and archives and powerful industry, forests and mountains along its borders served as strong and steadfast sheathing to this spring. It is for this that a people builds insurmountable strongholds of spirit and strength, maintains ranks of force along its borders, and puts its best on sleepless guard, so that no unclean footstep may enter, may not trouble or pollute this pure stream. Both of these literary evocations of springs sacralize contact with the place and its waters, suggesting pilgrimage and transformation, but also an interesting inversion of national geography. Leonov's language in particular suggests that everything that is public, visible, and mighty depends on this hidden, unacknowledged place. This is certainly a version of what Chris Ely has identified as the major trope of landscape aesthetics in 19th century Russia, a meager nature that situates national identity not in the sublime, but in the understated and often unseen. And I'm just interested here whether, how do particular places function in rhetoric like this? Is Leonov flipping the map of Soviet achievements, emphasizing and, in a sense, elevating a tiny place on which the whole Soviet world stands? Or is it the opposite, that this is actually an instance of the erasure of the particular, the elision of place in the surface of a grander vision? So there are a couple of things that I want to make sure to talk about before my time is up. I want to talk a little bit about the stories that get generated on these enormously rich websites. There are a number that I've looked at. There's one that is devoted exclusively to the springs of Orel. It was started in 2007, I think, by a young man who had tried to use a local map to find the springs and kind of got lost. And so he has started this project, which is has become a project that draws into it interactively all sorts of stories that people send him about local springs. There's also, that's the one in the top left. On the bottom is actually a national level website, which doesn't have the same level of detail and to some extent copies what's on the local site. But I find it really interesting because it includes a kind of Gostivaya Kniga where people place stories about their experiences and their memories of some of these places, which I find really, really interesting. There's also been streams of conversation about the springs on this other site, which is called orelstory.ru, and it's a kind of independent krayevedenia project. And so interestingly enough, in terms of how these stories start to circulate, the discussion went on for a couple of years. There were about 20 people who were actively participating. And they started with a list that was generated by the local environmental office, which tests these springs for coliform bacteria, particularly at the time of Epiphany, which is a time when ritually Russians would be going, Orthodox, would be going and dipping into the bodies of water, and so they're testing for water purity. But that's interesting because it was actually generated by this scientific body, environmental body. I think I'm not going to try to talk about this right now because I want to move along. But I'm fascinated. There's a huge mix of genres on these sites, and I would say that there's hagiography, there's legend, there's history, there's local legend, there's local history. There's history not only of, say, the pre-revolutionary era, but also the Soviet era. And the continued existence of these places through the Soviet era. And then there are histories of the recovery of the places. And that's part of what I actually find really quite fascinating about them, because recovery is a major motif in all of the stories of miraculous healing, which is like a big part of what is on these sites. But there's another sense in which these sites are about recovery, and that's less individual than I would say communal or communitarian. It's about the communal recovery of these places. And sometimes that's simply a matter of finding out where they are, clearing them out, and then starting to make them accessible to people who want to come to them. And sometimes that involves building infrastructure, but not always. I think I won't talk here about there are two, because I'm interested in the way places like this get represented in literary discourse or not. And so I somewhat accidentally stumbled on two different writers who have written, professional writers who have written about them. So in terms of streams of narrative, there's lots and lots and lots of amateur, local trading of memories. And then these two are professional writers, Oleg Davidov, who writes on a web journal called Переменный, and he's written about one of these sites as part of a huge, long series that he did called Места силы, which is really a kind of what I would call a sort of postmodern pilgrimage to sites of power. And he's interested in sort of why it is that, how to account for the aura and the power of places, some of which are monastic sites, but some of which, like this particular spring, is not attached to a monastery or has more of a kind of leftover Soviet infrastructure than a church infrastructure. The other writer is a local named Gennady Mikheyev, who's also writing a series of witcherki about regions, and he has a really nice essay about another one of these sacred sites. And I won't go into details, but the tones of both writers are really quite interesting. I think Davidov is more distant, sardonic, not very interested in local people, whom he calls aborigeni. It seems to me to call the locals Aborigines is not great. And then Mikheyev is really all about sort of capturing the stories of locals. I mean, I did start with Turgenev, and I'm interested in the way in which writers collect memories and stories and experiences of place. So I think maybe both of these writers are, in a sense, kind of continuations of that ocherk genre. Okay, final, we'll get to this in a minute. One way to think about these places is, of course, in ecological terms. For many visitors, they are sources of what is perceived as pure water. In a society where concerns about water quality and municipal water systems are widespread. The author of a 2002 essay in Mir i Muziej, a journal published at Yasnaya Polyana, suggests a de facto link between holy springs, local history, and environmental protection. Some of the springs are designated as local, regional, or federal level protected areas. This is not the zapovedniki that were mentioned, but памятники природы, which means in principle that all economic activities are curtailed. I already mentioned that the local environmental service does some testing of the water. There's a little bit of coverage in the local press about concerns with water quality and water sources, but it's mostly actually about fishing and access to fishing fishing sites and relatively little concern with water quality at the springs. The author of this, and I'll also just note without going into detail that there's an interesting kind of mix of scientific and sacred discourses on many of these websites, including references to Soviet-era water testing to provide some sort of indication of what the chemical makeup of the water is and why it might be medicinal or healing. Okay, I'll wind it down. This is just a slide that shows you how there's a kind of commodification of this that goes on as well, which is maybe a different version of the deterritorialization of place that might be going on in the Leonov, because I'd say that this is about a sort of generic Russian landscape without any indication of it being a particular place. This is not, or it's a kind of, yeah. Okay, I'll finish up here. The holy springs of the Orel region intrigue me for various reasons that have to do with ideas of nature, vernacular and official understandings of the sacred, and how everyday histories enter longer-lived fields of memory and meaning. I would identify these sites, both the springs themselves and the websites, as examples of placemaking in contemporary Russia. I mean by that both the physical construction and reconstruction of these places and the telling of stories about them. Whether this qualifies as civic action is, I think, an intriguing and important question. While there are examples on the Orel Radnik site of seemingly self-directed community recovery projects, there are other examples where powerful institutional forces have entered the picture. The Palesia Spring, for example, is cited in what is now a national park, a project initiated by then-Governor Yegor Stroyev in 1994. At the Andreevsky Radnik, in the southern part of the oblast, what were simple and charming open structures, including what I would call a vernacular altar, have been replaced by much more solid enclosed structures financed by a local businessman. Is such improvement a form of erasure of unsophisticated and vulnerable expression, or do local voices, desires, histories find in them new forms of inflection? That, I think, is a key question, not just for buildings, but for writing and the cultural imagination, forms of infrastructure in which the local can turn out to be the living water, which, as Leonov puts it, the country as a whole serves only to protect. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Our final speaker for this session, Diana Kurkovsky West, armed with a PhD in history and theory of architecture from Princeton, decided to try to understand planning and theories of scientific organization focused on post-war USSR. She must have done a pretty good job of it. She's currently the co-director of science and technology studies at the European University in St. Petersburg. So, Diana, I'm eager to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to start in a bit of an unusual place, I think, for a conversation about Russia, namely in Rio de Janeiro. But this image has become almost canonical for those in architecture who are very, very much concerned with this notion of smart cities or smarter cities. I've seen this in the New York Times. I've seen it in various other reproduced forms. This is IBM's newest integrated platform for running a city, looking very much like a space-age mission control room. The operations center in Rio is a giant wall of screens which show real-time video streams of jammed intersections, car accidents, power failures, weather events, activity in the favelas. It's kind of a monitoring system for security as well, and other problems that plague modern cities. Workers in white coveralls monitor these activities and manage the city's emergency response systems who, excuse me, sorry, negotiating the microphone here. I'm trying to see how I can see my screen and not have the microphone in the way. I know, that's not very smart, is it? Smart, but maybe I'm not so smart, I don't know. Okay, let's go there again. Workers in white coveralls monitor these activities. They manage the city's emergency response systems. This really was created in response to a bunch of floods that they had, so this was an emergency response system in a sense, and also providing additional police for events like the Soccer World Cup that was held there last summer. And some of this data is shared with Rio's inhabitants. The center's Twitter feed maintains continual traffic updates, while the weather service Alerta Rio sends SMS messages to over 10,000 subscribers and warns them of weather emergencies. So IBM touts this platform as one of a kind in its ability to integrate information from dozens of sources, and most recently to offer what they call predictive analytics that allow the city to establish budgets for capital improvement projects. According to IBM spokespeople, this would lead to smarter energy use, flexibility to allocate resources when and where they're most needed, creating more better use of taxpayer dollars. And this is kind of a hype, right? Everybody's jumping on the smart cities bandwagon these days. Places from South Korea to Canada are getting on board for these kinds of initiatives, right? Smart everything is the name of the game. Smart buildings, smart cities, smart towns, smart cars, you name it. In an interview with the New York Times, the IBM executive Guru Banavar stated, quote, "Smart is about information. Once you have the information and understand it, you know what you do with it, you're halfway to smart." So what does any of this have to do with Soviet Siberia? Of course, in part I'm being provocative, but only in part. In reading Banavar's enthusiastic statements regarding information, I had a distinct impression that I've kind of heard this story before. Not in conjunction with emergency response systems per se, but with the idea that by processing vast quantities of information, large and complex systems could be made much more manageable. And this was very much a premise of mid-century research in the field of cybernetics, which is where I did a lot of my dissertation work. Developed in the late 1940s by a number of scientists, among them most famously Norbert Wiener, who also had traveled to Russia and was translated in the 50s. Norbert Wiener, Rossa Ashby, John von Neumann, Stafford Beer, there were many others. Cybernetics was a generalized theory of communication and behavior in man and human and machine systems, human and animal systems. And this theory was based on the idea that through continual information feedback, the system, even a very large and complex system, could become virtually self-regulating. The idea was actually almost instantly appealing to American urban planners, looking for methods of controlling, rationalizing, and systematizing urban growth at a time when cities became hotbeds of social disparity and crime. But after the initial period of ideological denunciations that were very well articulated in Slava Gerovich's book, From Newspeak to Cyberspeak, cybernetics also became a very enticing agenda to the Soviet planning establishments and the scientific establishment as well, for reasons that pertain both to this dream of centralized control over all aspects of a very large command economy, but also, I argue, had interesting implications for regional planning and for thinking about the local in conjunction with the national. So my presentation today focuses on a theme that kind of undergirds both the IBM Smarter Cities interface and the ideas that gripped the late Soviet planning establishment, namely this theme of a vast quantity of information as a means of managing and regulating complex systems. This is the larger interest of my book project, which looks at the impact of what I call cybernetic thinking on Soviet theorizations of space. But here I'm going to focus on one chapter which deals with the territorial and production complexes, территориально-производственный комплекс, which was this key unit of regional planning in the Soviet time. And this is a complex idea. It's a feature of Soviet regional planning that strategically interlinked production, agriculture, transportation, and other key elements of a given region in some sort of an optimized manner. I will look here at the work of a late Soviet planning institute, an institute that still exists today in another form, but still associated with the Academy of Sciences, namely the Institute of Economic Economics and Organization of Industrial Production. It's an institute located in Novosibirsk. And I will focus on their research into what they called dynamic mathematical modeling. Moreover, I'd like to highlight, moreover, I'd like to highlight an interesting thread I found in the work of this institute, namely the focus on the environment. And one of the people I'm going to talk about actually still teaches at the Novosibirsk State University. And I'd like to embed this in a bit of a greater context of mathematical modeling together with this new kind of local global or local national paradigm. So this is not a great map, and I apologize for this, but getting good Soviet maps of anything is a huge problem, as you all know. So this is an incredibly schematic map from the 1950s of the various territorial production complexes in the Soviet Union. This is about the best I can do at the moment. But the Soviet territorial production complex is actually a very slippery notion. It continually, every piece of literature I look at defines it somewhat differently. And it means something a little different in various points in time in various regions, but as a whole, they were regional planning units that combined industry, natural resources, and urban space or settlements into immense, comprehensively planned, integrated systems, largely for the sake of efficiency and a more effective use of resources. Really, a lot of these ideas are based around extraction of natural resources of various kinds. The concept of a TPC, I'm just going to call them that, predated the advent of cybernetics. It was developed by the economic geographer Nikolai Kolosovsky in the 1940s as a theory of economic regionalism. And it was aimed at maximizing the economic productivity of each industrial zone in the USSR. The idea stipulated that industries should be united in their shared use of natural resources, which was more efficient somehow, and Kolosovsky called them energy production cycles. So they had to be sited in proximity with the industry, with the resource in question, and several adjacent industries would share the resource. Kolosovsky's conceptualization divided the entire country into economic regions developed on the basis of production, essentially forming a nationwide network of TPCs. Every one of these economic regions combined industries, natural resources, transportation, workforce in some sort of a comprehensive manner. It was supposed to become predominantly self-sufficient and really only allow minimal inter-TPC trade and resource sharing. So this system was really meant to eliminate redundancies and waste of time and resources. So to this end, each region was sort of to do its own developing in terms of housing, agriculture, and so on and so forth, and maintain a high degree of economic independence. There were several strategically important TPCs constructed in the Stalin era, most notably the coal mines at Kuzbas in the 1930s, and other regional plans like Mineralные Vody in the Caucasus, Donbass region. However, these were very different from the late Soviet projects that I looked at, in that they paid much closer attention to architectural engineering requirements rather than the overall economic and territorial integration. But with Khrushchev's rise to power, the focus of TPC planning began to change, it began to expand. On a lot of Kolosovsky's research, who was already dead at the time, it was actually revived posthumously. A lot of his works really are beginning to be published heavily in the 1960s. But this was also very much part of Khrushchevian reorientation of the ministry-based system toward his regionalization efforts of the entire country, which of course was overturned once he was ousted from office, but with that new kind of hybrid system that emerged afterwards, it nonetheless, the focus on TPC planning nonetheless remained pretty heavy in late Soviet literature. Even more significantly, of course, Siberia was beginning to feature heavily already in Khrushchev's imagining of the future of natural resource extraction. It had actually already, as you I'm sure know, had been a feature of this kind of imagination of what you can do with natural resources since the Tsarist times. But with construction of the Baikal-Amur main line, this became a real major issue because a lot of new towns were emerging and a lot of new projects were being put into place. As Christopher Ward, of course, discussed in his book Brezhnev's Folly, the construction project brought back the themes of Prometheanism in Soviet large-scale industrial construction. It rallied the country's youth around another epic triumph of engineering against hostile nature and created an immense media apparatus advocating the bomb as the single most important project of the era of developed socialism. The Bratsk GES, which we've already heard several times about, became the backbone of one of the most significant TPCs of the late Soviet era, the Bratsk-Ust-Ilimsk Territorial Production Complex. And I'd like to now spend a few minutes discussing it in order to illustrate what a TPC optimization might entail. So the Bratsk GES became the principal element of the Bratsk-Ust-Ilimsky TPC, one of the most productive TPCs in the region, encompassing the middle sections of the Angara River and adjacent territories together called Priangarye. The bulk of the energy produced by the GES served to power an immense aluminum production plant, Bratski Aluminievy Zavod, as well as the Bratsk and Ust-Ilimsk timber industry and paper mills. In addition to the city of Bratsk, the TPC included other cities and towns like Ust-Ilimsk, Zheleznogorsk-Ilimsky, and Vikhrevka. Zheleznogorsk-Ilimsky is the region's mining center with a prominent open iron ore pit and processing industry, and it's on the bomb line between Bratsk and Ust-Kut. Other elements in the TPC include a chlorine plant, one of Russia's largest cellulose plants, while the region's ample forests support quite a large timber industry. So strategically, TPC optimization was seen as part of optimizing the economic structure of the Soviet Union in its entirety through controlling and mathematical modeling of the smaller scale units, all the while considering the big picture. And I'm going to look now in particular at this institute, which was formed in 1958 as an arm of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk. Of course, this is also part of Akademgorodok, right, the new experimental science city that's created at this time in Siberia. The institute had branches not only in Novosibirsk, but in Krasnoyarsk, Barnaul, Tyumen, Irkutsk, and others, and produced a considerable amount of research coordinating Siberia's economic and regional planning. There was a head researcher who actually spearheaded a lot of the particular kinds of modeling I'm looking at. His name was Mark Bandman. He is no longer alive, but he was a Novosibirsk native, which is kind of rare at the time. He headed the Department of Mathematical Modeling at the Institute, and he is often credited for fully articulating the scientific theory between TPC planning and optimization. His colleagues describe him as, I like this description, he was born with geography in his blood. His name appears on hundreds of publications emerging from the Institute between 1957 and 2003. And his method was sort of famous for its insistence on what he called dynamic mathematical modeling. A particularly important element of the TPC planning literature was this insistence that, you can't just optimize all features within the system and let it roll. You have to account for change over time. And this is actually different from a lot of the earlier Soviet attempts at mathematical modeling, which entailed kind of these static systems which are not going to change. So here we have several elements to this discussion. Firstly, regions need to be designed in a manner where all economic, geographic, industrial, and settlement aspects are accounted for, and their relationship is somehow expressed mathematically. However, this itself is not sufficient. Models also need to be designed in such a way that they can change, that they can include unknown variables, and of course, they all need to still function within this national network, right? So they need to be optimized on both a local scale and on a national scale. This is particularly visible in one of the publications that came out of the work and was actually translated into English, so it gained some prominence. It was called Regional Development in the USSR, modeling the formation of Soviet territorial production complexes in 1976. And they articulate these new methods of nonlinear modeling for optimizing TPCs, looking at scheduling, efficiency. They even have something that looks a little bit like game theory. So they're really messing with this idea of dynamic systems that can change. But what marks the language of the entire publication is this interest in optimization, flexibility, but also in the notion that somehow this data needs to be continually collected, right? So data on all the production facilities needs to be collected. All the geographic data needs to be collected, needs to be monitored. It needs to be plugged into these complex mathematical equations, and you will have your optimized answer for that particular point in time. The problem is, of course, that they're doing all of this without computers. So you have these vast documents, continual documents that are produced by the Institute, very complex. And it looks things like this. I'm not going to even attempt to go through this, but that's more or less what all these documents look like. They're very mathematically sophisticated, but there is an assumption that somehow in the future, once the Soviet economy is cybernetized, you can actually make it work. But for now, it needs to remain somewhat theoretical. There's an interesting dimension to this research as well, which is an ecological dimension. There was a researcher, Burmatova, whom I've mentioned before. She's still in Novosibirsk. She was quite young at the time, working with Bandman on the notion of optimizing the ecological aspect of these territorial production complexes. And she did some interesting work which actually responded to another very important document that came out in 1972. It's the Limits to Growth model that was produced from data collected at MIT. It was a computer-generated model that was basically referred to as a computer curve to doomsday, right? It basically said that, if we keep industrializing the way we're going and the way the world population is going, we're going to run out of resources. And she essentially said, well, no, we're not going to run out of resources because we just haven't optimized them sufficiently. And what she advocated was focusing on the local scale and looking at these territorial production complexes and bringing the economic variable into the mathematical model. So she wrote, quote, "A large number of problems can be resolved only at a local or regional level. In a number of cases, particular problems of conservation, which developed as local, can, if not attended to, spread to a large territory and become regional, national, and even global. Thus, in order to prevent small problems from becoming large, one must first and foremost solve the problems of the small scale." And she continues, "Moreover, solving the same problems of conservation can be fundamentally different on various territories because of specificities, both natural and economic." So once again, you see this idea that on the one hand, there are specificities, they're very local. On the other hand, there are these kind of meta methods, right? Somehow cybernetic methods that can be used to do some data crunching, to adjust these visions, to make them better, to solve, to optimize, solve a lot of the problems with ecology. She cites a number of mathematical researchers and also American regional planners, Walter Izard from the American Regional Planning School. She polemicizes with a number of them. But there is this emphasis here, and it's an interesting emphasis because she also talks about how the national may not understand the problems of the local, right? So they really need to arise from the local scale. So the problem with environmental degradation would be solved through a mechanism that would continually reevaluate the goals of TPC optimization vis-a-vis its environmental impact and be used to balance production costs against the costs to the environment. So she comes up with this model that would do this. And this leads me to my final point about TPC planning. For a critical assumption that exists in all this research on TPC optimization, and this point goes back to my interest in cybernetic thinking and a certain kind of positivism and idealism that it implies. It is an assumption that even very complex economic and spatial systems can be continually re-optimized by having access to vast quantities of real-time data, which of course they didn't have. So there was a lot of dreaming about what they'll be able to do with these models once they have the data. In this case, a kind of a smart Siberia. Theories of Soviet regional planning in Siberia envisioned the continually fine-tuned and re-optimized network of economic and spatial relations among the industries and settlements. They also recognized that new informational input would result in renegotiation of the optimal relations and would therefore leave room for growth and change. In the end, the research served to highlight the potential of information for managing Soviet geo-economic structure. Its application to the actual planning and economy, however, would be dependent on the ability to access, process, evaluate, and feed data into a network of future computers. It was tacitly assumed by the researchers and actually overtly stated on a few occasions that computerization and cybernetization of the Soviet spatial and economic structure would take place at a future date. In fact, one of the people I interviewed basically said, well, they promised us cybernetics, but they never gave us cybernetics. So I'll end here.
Thank you very much. If the speakers could sort of recongregate themselves up here, we've got time for some questions. Once in my life, I was on a commission that was trying to pair biotic reserves in Russia with reserves in the USA. And the idea, this is back in the Cold War days, that if the USSR and America could agree to monitor global change in their parks and reserves, that would then spread worldwide, and we'd have observation stations as to what we were doing to the planet. This, of course, fell apart with the Afghan invasion. But the interesting part that came out of that, one of the stickiest points, was all the reserves in the U.S. are parks, and they have people traipsing through them all the time. And the reserves in Russia were reserves. They kept people out of them, they were fenced in, they were well protected. And the Russians had a tremendously difficult time understanding what we thought we were doing.
So my first question is to Jane about this cult of Holy Springs. Is it the same spirituality that you see in Turgenev 19th century literature? Or is it, because in your presentation I felt a very strange mixture of sort of traditional, supposedly traditional Russian double belief, where pagan rituals are wrapped into semi-Christian clothes, with New Age, with very much American New Age, very similar to my Boulder settings. It sounds very much Boulder-esque to me. But a broader question to Jane and Sarah probably. So Jane mentioned Leonov's novel, and you certainly remember that this spring plays a very important role in the further development, and the very negative character there, Graziansky, who is simultaneously linked to the Soviet ideology and to Akhranka at the culmination point of the debate about the destiny of the Russian forest, sticks his cane into the throat of this spring, and that's the metaphor that Leonov uses. So obviously the spring serves as the throat, heart of Russia, right, which is being destroyed by all these rationalists, all these communists, all this Graziansky with this suspiciously foreign-sounding last name, and that what connects this subject with Sarah's presentation. Not, that's my question. Is it by chance, or is it interconnected, that Leonov, as we know, was one of the gurus of the so-called Russian party, the party of Russian nationalists, as it formed in the 50s, 60s, as Mitrokhin argues. And Rasputin was one, not just remarks, of course, but a very outspoken representative of this party, one of its leaders. So how is this veneration of nature becomes the source of rabid nationalism? Or does it become? Right, okay.
Very good. Please? Yes.
Are we on? Okay, thank you. I realize this is supposed to be ecological identity, but I can't resist the temptation, since we have a couple of environmental specialist to ask something about the environment itself. I recently got dragooned into writing something about the current Russian economic crisis and looked at the budget. Both of the projects that involve Lake Baikal have been shrunk by about 50%, and the new national program for Chistaya Voda, clean water, was zeroed. And I'm wondering if either of you could talk about what the impact of that is likely to be.
Sort of keep us busy for about
Yuri
15
Urbanovich,
minutes.
UVA. I have very short question to Diana Kurkovska. You mentioned Khrushchev's approach, to regional development, and I have purely, historical question. Under his leadership, as far as I know, was seriously considered the question of moving capital city of the USSR from Moscow to Siberia. And, this question is still, on the surface. Yeah. Can you comment? Do you know anything about it? Thank you.
Wonderful book by a guy named Doug Wiener.
Read the literature. Right?
Yeah, and he says that there are actually 3 different strands that come into the formation of the first Zapovednik, which is early 20th century, and that it's scientific, aesthetic, and then there's a third one that I'm forgetting. But there's a strong kind of scientific push, so that the origins of the park system in the U.S. just came out of a very different socio-cultural context. I think that's, I don't know.
Yellowstone, funny geysers and stuff. Let me push on. Jane, you were up next with pagan rituals.
Yeah, so in terms of Mark's question about spirituality, I think in Turgenev, the spirituality of place is really associated with the narod, with the peasants. And as far as I can tell, and this is really kind of impressionistic and anecdotal rather than, I haven't done like surveys and stuff, but it seems to me that the folks who are going to these springs now on a kind of, every day, not just for church observations, but are more middle class. That it's certainly not just associated with there's not that kind of intact, quote unquote, folk culture anymore. And I think that they go for many, many different reasons. So both for utilitarian and also for what we might loosely call spirituality. The question about whether there's some sort of mix of what you refer to as New Age is really interesting, because I actually did a little bit of interviewing and some questionnaires in connection with this. And what was interesting is that the woman who responded, using my contacts in Orel, the woman who responded who seemed to be most knowledgeable and most observant of certain rituals, Orthodox rituals, of fasting, of going to a church service, and of changing her clothes before going to the spring, which she was going to on a monastic site, was also the person who talked about energetics and its impact on her, sense of well-being. So that there was just in terms of the language she was using, there was this really interesting mixture of orthodoxy and what sounds kind of New Age. The other thing that I'd point out to in terms of nationalism, I know that I'm going to quote something I didn't get to read here, and this is this same fellow who wrote in Mir i Muzej, which is a museum ship journal that gets published, and he maintains quite adamantly that it's important. Preservation needs to be preservation and environmental preservation needs to be grounded not in rationalism, which he said the past experience has shown to fail, and that it needs to be grounded in spirituality and emotional bonds, and that, how does he put it? We will be able to protect springs and thereby rivers only on the basis of a sacral relationship with them. That's why building chapels and outfitting springs is welcomed by everyone, regardless of their worldview. I had an interesting conversation with a young man here about Muslim use of springs in a different region. It might be interesting to have some of your experience sort of drawn into the conversation. Svetloyar, which is like one of the most famous sacred water sites in Russia, where supposedly Kitesh was located, is actually really interesting for how multi-confessional it is. Like everything from the Hare Krishnas to the Orthodox to the Old Believers to New Age varieties. Now that's a couple of years ago, and these things are always changing, obviously. But oh, and there is a Mir Shamana, there's a website of shamanism that has some of these springs on it as well. Oh, and the commercialization, I can actually answer that. I actually went and looked at bottled water issues. The top 10 bottled waters include whatever multinational concern it is that does this one. Svetoy Istochnik at that point was number 8, and it was the only one. I actually went and looked at the advertising. Svetoy Istochnik was the only one that tried to tap into this kind of Russian national identity. All of the others, and some of them were, the traditional Caucasus waters were really low down on the list. They also have a really different taste. And the industry analysis was that we're not keeping up with the Europeans, we're not selling enough bottled water. And so that there's a great growth potential for that. But it was actually, most of the advertising wasn't Russia specific at all. It was kind of generic. Not that, I mean, the most recent reference I saw to it in the media was actually some allegation that they were, that their water had been contaminated, which didn't do any good for their market share. Yeah.
Didn't it used to be sold by the church, or is it still sold by the church?
It claims to be blessed by a particular...
No, but the church, I know in the 1990s was making money off of it.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
They got it from 2 American businessmen.
Okay. Well, no, that was a very dubious question of where the water was from, even in the 1990s.
Yeah.
The church got into a lot of trouble with that.
Yeah.
That's a great question about the local specificity. Of course, you have Akademgorodok there, and of course, Akademgorodok is not just a science city, but it emphasizes computers, right? It's supposed to be this new computer center for the entire Soviet Union. So there is, as far as cybernetics go, this is definitely a hotbed of a lot of this activity. And what happens with this institute in Siberia, which is very interesting to me, is that this emphasis on the dynamic modeling really has a very different feature. It has a very different character to it than some of the earlier things that are really talking about, like mikrorayon and optimizing the mikrorayon, right? Optimizing all of its various features. Building it and then letting it sit as it is, right? At that point, it becomes a self-regulating system. You don't really need to worry about what happens to it later. Whereas the stuff that comes out of this institute really begins to deal with change over time, and that new resources will be discovered. There's tremendous population growth in this region at the time, enormous, of course. New towns are being built all the time, so there is this practical need as well for dealing with rapidly changing factors. And I do think that this environmental sensitivity, which some others, of course, have written about, you know, a lot of the initiatives coming out of Siberia, from the youth movements, from the Komsomol, from Akademgorodok itself, also play a role in a particular spirit. So yes, I do think that there's something very local about the notion of dynamic mathematical models here in this case. Not that they didn't exist somewhere else. This is an important part of mathematical modeling also in the US at the time. Vasily Leontiev, who was a kind of this Russo-American mathematician, was engaging with a lot of this kind of research. People at MIT were engaging with this kind of research. So this isn't Russia-specific per se, and this is not even locally specific, but I think that the focus on this kind of modeling in Siberia at the time is very interesting, whereas a lot of the other kind of modeling going on in the Soviet Union was really geared at kind of this sort of finality, right? We optimize the model and then we just let it run.
Diana, if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit, because when you were actually talking, you had the quote up about conservation, which talked about local and global solutions, basically, to conservation problems. And that stuff to me sounded like Lyapunov's stability theory, which it's probably not familiar to many people anyway, but essentially the Russians, actually Apanov was a Siberian, if I remember right, reinvented a theory of mathematical stability unique to Russians and largely not understood outside of Russia for quite a while, which essentially allowed you to mathematically determine over a small operating range if a system would be stable or not, and to determine over a large global extent whether a system would be stable or not. The Americans, who were absolutely slaves to computers, had to solve the problem about solving it locally and then solving it locally nearby and locally nearby. So they used computer muscle rather than pure mathematics. And you sort of saw that in the space program. The Russians could hurl stuff into space. They didn't know where it was going, I don't think, but they knew it was going into a stable orbit. And for the U.S. to do this, they had to get their rockets to go through windows where they'd calculated if it goes through there at a certain time. So I think there's actually something to be mined off of this almost indigenous mathematical theories of stability that come out of, as best I know, Siberia.
Well, and it's also very interesting because when you look at the mathematical modeling at MIT, Jay Forrester and the work that was being done there, a lot of it, right, very quickly went to computers. So you have this idea you're going to model these systems, you take them to computers, then they get heavily criticized because they're really, you know, the actual elements that are being included are not very well thought out, and in some cases there was accusations of fudging the data, but, right, it immediately goes to computers. In the Soviet case, although they're bemoaning the fact that they don't have the computers, it really forces them to keep going with these very, very sophisticated mathematical models. So there is that other side as well.
And to reground ourselves, we had the question about Khrushchev moving the capital.
Oh, right. I must admit, I don't know very much about this. I would love to know more. This sounds fascinating.
There you go. Yes, please. We got about 5 minutes left, I believe. Let's just take questions as they arise.
My name is Lou Tanner. I'm not institutionalized as of yet. I just have a question in connection with the Capitol movement. I didn't know of that either, but I do know that I think it was only in the last decade of the Soviet period that they formally gave up on the idea of dynamiting some of the rivers in Siberia to flow south instead of, sorry? Anyway,
it was nuclear explosions that they were going to use to move the Angara River basin to lower it, and then use that water from the Bratsk, or from Lake Baikal to create the basin for the hydroelectric dam in Bratsk. But also there were, you know, all these projects about reversing the direction of Siberian rivers and all that good stuff,
but
all using nuclear explosions.
The world was kind of nuts then. The U.S. at the same time was planning to blow a new Panama Canal through Nicaragua.
And do stuff in Alaska as well.
Yeah, so these are strange and wonderful times.